ruins across the landscape that give us clues that there was a once great civilization that encompassed the entire world. The civilization that we refer to as Tartaria, the civilization that preceded ours. And while we may not know its actual name or what language they spoke, we know that this civilization existed, found in the wondrous ruins that dot the landscape. Indeed, many still in use today by our current civilization. But how did this wondrous civilization fall? What was the final chapter in its true history? Today we are going to explore that when we look at the final conflict of Tartaria. The legacy of Gog-Magog, Tartaria's final conflict. In the Five Eras theory, we posit that there were several civilizations that preceded our own. There may have been 4, there may have been 5. These civilizations were destroyed by what we consider hard resets, and then the civilization had to begin again. Were these natural disasters, or were these artificially induced disasters that destroyed these civilizations? In the 4th era Tartarian civilization, we see that it had 3 phases: a rise, an ascendancy, and a decline and a fall. During its ascendancy, we believe that it won a great conflict against some unknown external enemy. We've posited at the locations and origins of this potential enemy. Yet in this exploration, we're going to consider the final conflict that Tartaria faced, which brought about the downfall of this wondrous civilization, the civilization that managed to build incredible structures all across the land, cities that were built on top of the ruins of previous civilizations that we call the Foundation Eras. The Five Eras theory explains the fact that we do have deep structures with many foundations and many structures that are built on top of the remnants of previous structures. But there may have been many more eras. Indeed, the many memorials that we see across the land. Were these really memorials to national achievements, as we're told, great conflicts that we know of in our official history? Or are the other symbols that we see that don't make sense to us representative of something else? A great victory that Tartaria won in its first conflict during its civilization. Perhaps that explains why we see all these discrepancies with what we would think of as Civil War monuments or other great conflicts that we're told of in our history. Memorials that were simply repurposed and redesigned to reflect the achievement of Tartaria. And yet, Tartaria faced an adversary that it could not possibly overcome. The legacy of Gog-Magog. Gog-Magog, it has a biblical reference to it, although, oddly enough, it appears in multiple religions, mythology, or official history, or scriptures, or whatever you want to call them. Gog-Magog represents an evil force, originally referring to 2 individuals, and yet in many of the maps of the Mappamundi and the history of the Middle Ages, we're told that Gog-Magog represented an entire force of individuals. Perhaps it was this sort of external threat that faced Tartaria that they were unable to contend with. Or maybe it refers to the fact that many individuals within their own defense forces, this civilization's great leaders, who were corrupted or subverted by the external forces that had somehow been unleashed on their civilization. Or perhaps it was merely the same adversary that Tartaria's predecessors had faced, and now they had returned to exact their revenge on the people of Tartaria. Initially, their first conflict was unsuccessful. The unified peoples of Tartaria were unable to be overcome. Therefore, this invasion force, this external threat, had to change their tactics. And we have accounts of Gog-Magog being people who were completely and totally uncivilized, and perhaps not even human beings in many ways, shapes, or forms. We even have accounts that they were individuals who were cannibals and did not recognize the precepts of society. Whatever the reality is, we have many maps from the Middle Ages that indicate that the invaders of Gog-Magog were confined to a particular geographical area. And indeed, the residents and the denizens of Tartaria were threatened, as it seems as though these ruthless attackers were unrelenting in their efforts to completely destroy the people. But we just don't know if this was simply an external threat or if this was something that attacked Tartaria from 2 sides, externally and internally, as we do have accounts of individuals who were corrupted by the influences of Gog-Magog. There's also the account of Alexander the Great, the hero, at least the hero when it comes to contending with the threat of Gog-Magog. Gog-Magog, the nation with uncivilized individuals that was destroying all the other civilized peoples of the world at that time. And maybe Alexander the Great represents Belisarius and Lucius Aurelian, leaders who we're told have a place in history, but may in fact have been the final leaders of the great Tartarian civilization, trying to defend it from the unrelenting attacks from the threat of Gog-Magog. Many of the maps that we have from the Middle Ages, or the Mappa Mundi, indicate that the threat of Gog-Magog was confined to a geographical area. They were trapped by walls and natural terrain features that were reinforced by obstacles. There are many different biblical references from both Christianity and Islam that indicate the actions of Alexander the Great and the threat faced by Gog-Magog. Very odd for something that only came from one particular area of the land that it's referenced by multiple civilizations and multiple religions in our current civilization, giving the indication that perhaps there's a lot more to these origin stories and this threat of Gog-Magog than simple mythology or simple fantasy. When we look at many of the images in the accounts, we see various efforts by the people led by Alexander, the remnants of the Tartarian civilization, to attempt to safeguard their civilization by building walls and building forts and building outposts that would survive this attack. What we don't know is if this attack from Gog-Magog came before or after what we consider the Great Reset event. There might have been a series of disasters that befell Tartaria, and they turned to their final great commanders to try to defend and safeguard their civilization. We know that their efforts failed over time, and yet we still have the remnants of their fortifications. We're told of great walls built across the land, and indeed the Gates of Alexander, which exists to this day in the Caucasus Mountain region, may have been an attempt to try to forestall this attack, this invasion by these forces of Gog-Magog, this nation that had no civilized rules, that seemed to be unrelenting in its efforts to destroy the people of Tartaria. And when we look at the maps that we have, we can even find the natural passes through the mountains of the Caucasus. We're told that the Gates of Alexander fall right here, where there's reinforcing fortifications on the natural mountain passes. Although for all we know, perhaps the original mountains themselves may not be quite as natural as we're led to believe. When we study more of the maps of the advances of the individuals of Gog-Magog, or this terrifying nation, or whatever this external threat truly was, we can see that the walls were not successful in keeping them contained. That eventually, according to subsequent maps, they spread across the entire land, destroying every civilization that came in their way. And indeed, we do have historical accounts that try to relate this to other nations that we're told were simple hordes that crossed the land. It wasn't just the Mongols, it was also the many other forces of the Huns and the barbarian invasions. Perhaps all these refer to the same force, the original force of Gog-Magog, simply being hidden at different points in our history, with different individuals all referring to the same event. Perhaps the great leader Alexander the Great, whatever his name really was also corrupted by this influence. We have accounts and images that show Alexander the Great even working with the devil, or at least the forces of evil, to try to contain these forces of Gog-Magog. Perhaps he fell to the corruption and the influence that had overcome many of the leaders of Tartaria, and this led to the unfortunate fall and total destruction of their civilization. After they were hit by the natural disaster, or perhaps it was an artificially induced disaster, they were left at the mercy of these relentless forces of Gog-Magog. This would explain these isolated monasteries that we have, and what we view as reset compounds. Perhaps they were also survival compounds, the last-ditch attempt by a civilization that could see its end rapidly coming, trying to preserve anything and everything that they could of their civilization, their society, their true history, all that they had learned, even their architectural capabilities. And yet we know that very little of the previous civilization managed to reach ours. Indeed, to even question its existence is oftentimes ridiculed. But we can look at these subsequent maps and we can see that the remaining people of the world were the ones who were waiting for their final destruction, that the efforts of Alexander or whoever the commanders were had failed, that Gog-Magog had succeeded in utterly destroying the Fourth Era civilization, or at least completing its destruction. Where do all these origin stories derive from? If we consider the Olympic opening ceremony at the Olympics in Sochi in 2014 in Russia, perhaps we have a depiction of the actual account of the fall of this civilization that preceded ours, that we call Tartaria on our channel. Now, why would we have clues that are mixed into Olympics opening ceremonies? Perhaps it's the same reason why we have so much subtext that comes into our films. There are individuals who may be aware, or at least have some sort of awareness of what transpired in the past, and therefore they attempt to integrate it, whether it's in the plot of certain films or even in a depiction in the opening ceremony of the Olympics. At Sochi, we see many interesting things of the rise of a civilization. Of course, our current mainstream will tell us that this is merely the depiction of the rise of Russia, and that this is supposed to be a Russian patriotic ceremony. And indeed, it may well be. But yet, when we look into the subtext and a lot of the symbolism of this particular ceremony, we see something that seems to allude to far more than just the rise of a single nation. Of course, we recall the fact that our current civilization seems to operate on the basic principle of division. Geographical division, division of the people, division of economic and social class. Was it always that way? It's hard to say, but when you actually go and you observe this opening ceremony from Sochi, you can see that there are many different aspects of humanity that seem to be depicted. Not something that's pertinent to one particular group of people, but perhaps something that depicts the story of us all. The unfortunate events that occurred with the last reset, where the civilization known as Tartaria was completely destroyed. Not a civilization that was confined to one particular set of lands or even one single continent, but one that encompassed the entire land, the world, all of its peoples. And when you look at some of the events that were depicted in the opening ceremony of Sochi, you can get the idea that they're really telling the entire story of humanity. It's from these depictions and these displays that we have an indication of what may have happened to the Fourth Era civilization. We have a force that seems to have come through some sort of strange portal. How exactly did this happen, we don't know the details on. But we even consider the actual Olympic ceremony with the lighting of the 5 Olympic rings, and we're told that the 5th ring didn't properly light, and it was merely a technical difficulty that bedeviled the ceremony. However, it's a very appropriate choice of words because we consider that 5th ring looks like a portal. And indeed, we did see that portal depicted in another part of the ceremony. We saw a representation that could have been the Fourth Era civilization that we call Tartaria, represented by a city here, threatened by a force that initially they were able to overcome. The Fourth Era civilization winning their initial victory when they were confronted by whatever the malevolent force truly was. And we consider that to have happened during the Ascendancy period, or the very height of Tartaria's capabilities, when they managed to achieve their greatest architectural achievements, and they had a unified civilization. We have other depictions within the ceremony that show this force coming through a portal and threatening the civilization. Now, of course, this could all just simply be interpretation by what was merely intended to be a beautiful nationalist ceremony. But yet, we're always told that's the explanation, and we have many other strange depictions at many other Olympics, not just the Olympics that occurred in Russia. So it appears as though there's much more that's actually being conveyed that may be hidden in the subtext or the details behind these elaborate opening ceremonies. We can find many representations that might reflect the greater and grander nature of humanity, a nature which we are oftentimes told to ignore or doesn't truly exist. I suggest that you watch the entire opening ceremony at Sochi and the other Olympics, and watch the opening of the Olympic ceremony at London in 2012 and many others. You'll see strange depictions. You'll see some things that do seem like they're representing the athletes and the competition that's about to occur and the manner of world unity, at least that's what we're told the Olympics represents. But when you look deeper into it, you will find a different message. You will see that they seem to be conveying something else that happened in the distant past, without actually saying it. And perhaps the Olympic opening ceremony at Sochi is most notable for what it depicted, with the aspect of a portal, a civilization initially being triumphant, and then eventually being overcome by a malevolent force. A malevolent force that managed to change its tactics and overcome what was a unified and powerful civilization, also a people who were strong internally. There's other strange aspects to the ceremony where you see the way that things are depicted and illuminated and how exactly they show a different nature of humanity. Oftentimes this is something that we do get in these Olympic ceremonies, and as mentioned before, it's not just in the opening ceremonies. It can oftentimes be found in many of the plot details of many films. Even some of the greatest science fiction films have many allusions to the old world or the previous civilization. So if this is where we derive what actually happened, then how did Tartaria's decline really come about? Clearly there were vulnerabilities within the civilization that came about that enabled this malevolent force to overcome it, and this is what led to the final conflict and the downfall of the civilization. We consider the fact that in the Five Eras theory, we have three civilizations that preceded Tartaria, or the Fourth Era civilization. Now, were the civilizations that preceded Tartaria as unified, or were there other details behind them? We really don't know, and we don't really even have clues. We only have scattered legends and myths. What sort of ascendancy did they reach? How far did they come in their architectural capabilities? Or, more importantly, how far did they come in their capabilities of the individual? We have many myths and accounts, whether it's in religious texts or other means, that indicate that human beings in the distant past actually lived much longer. We're told that these are merely legends, and yet when we look around we can see the remnants of a great civilization that had much greater capability than we can imagine. We can think on the earlier eras. Perhaps before Tartaria in the Fourth Era, there was star fort builders in the Third Era, a people who managed a tremendous architectural and geometrically precise, focused civilization. Perhaps it was much more ordered than we can imagine. And it's not to say that any one of these civilizations were completely utopian. Indeed, they all must have had their own vulnerabilities and own issues, and that's why they continue to fall. And perhaps that's what we are unfortunately forced to live, is a cycle. The cyclic repetition of the rise and fall of civilizations. Or perhaps there is a way that we can move beyond it. Perhaps there's a way we can preserve all that which we learn and not have to go through this cycle. We look at what our current civilization is, the Fifth Era as we call it. A civilization that has the hallmarks of a pseudo-civilization in many ways. In the fact that it seems to represent many of the values that we had in the past, and yet there's something about them that just don't feel as though they're completely genuine. As though we're told of wonders and greatness that we can ascend to, and yet all the time we're constantly given reasons why we just can't reach it. Why we don't have the ability to take care of all of our own people, or why we're constantly at conflict with one another. And perhaps the reasons they give us are true. Perhaps there are legitimate reasons for why we have so much division and so much conflict. Or could it be that what we experience every day is simply the remnants of what came before, or the modern and current incarnation of it? The continued division of civilizations and human beings is exactly the vulnerabilities that existed in the previous civilizations that led to their downfall. Yes, one would say there may be a lot of speculation, but I don't believe there's as much speculation as we're led to believe because of the fact that all of these accounts exist in all of our religious texts in every major society that we have across our current civilization today. So it would appear that there are accounts of that civilization reaching its ascendancy, having abilities that we can only begin to imagine to this day. How far did they really go, though, in the last civilization? Did they actually have the ability to draw power in many different ways? Did they have the ability to generate power from the air, from crystals? Did they have all their power needs met? And as a result, they managed to achieve a balanced society. In other words, a balance between an individual contributing to society and then a society that genuinely contributes to the welfare of an individual. Perhaps it's all just a dream, something that cannot actually be achieved. Or maybe that's just what we're supposed to think. Whatever the reality, the undenied achievements of the past have to be considered, because those ruins still exist to this day. And indeed, many of those things that we call ruins, the state capitals, the opera houses, all the wondrous structures that we consider palaces, and then we consider the remnants of the star forts that we have to this day, many of which are in wondrous shape despite all that they've been through, with time, reset, and then even if we accept the mainstream's account of history, consider all the other factors of weathering and the conflicts that they've been through. And yet these structures stand to this day, many in very pristine condition, and many being used currently as government buildings or commercial buildings or any other number of uses. Also consider the infrastructure and logistical capability of the civilizations that came before us. Great airships that had unlimited capability to move vast objects and much great amount of materials across vast distances in a rapid amount of time. Clearly they had some method of energy generation or fuel consumption that was vastly superior to anything we know today. For all we know, perhaps what we use today is the surviving remnants, the derivatives of what came before. Of course, the oftentimes theme that we're given is that we are supposedly at our technological ascendancy at this point now. But is that really true? Or is the reality that we've simply declined from having much more advanced technological capability in the past? Many of the clues that we have and a lot of the evidence that we can see indicate that the civilizations that came before us actually had a greater technological capacity. We cannot replicate the buildings that were constructed in the past. We supposedly can build taller buildings, although we don't know if that's true, and supposedly we can build structures that are much more effective than the structures in the past in terms of housing larger numbers of people and caring for the needs of many people. And yet we can't build or reconstruct many of the state capitals that we have in the United States. You don't see anyone building the great opera houses or palaces that are across Europe, or whatever current designation we give these wondrous structures or edifices across the land. Yet we also consider the destruction and descent of the civilization that preceded ours. They had much greater capability, and yet they still fell. And why exactly did that happen? We've explored that on the channel, and we consider the reset event that occurred, whether it was a natural or artificially induced disaster. Was it plasma fire from the sky? Was it some sort of cymatic force that induced a mud flood and completely destroyed the soil? Was it a vast tsunami or flood? Or was it all three of these events, which eventually eroded and destroyed the civilization's capability to exist and defend itself, leaving it in a state of vulnerability? We don't know the exact details, but we have many different clues. We also consider the fact that there were no doubt survivors from these horrific events, and even from the second conflict, the final conflict that Tartaria faced that led to its final destruction, the attack of what we consider Gog-Magog. Was that really any of its names, or are these just the names that we assign to these events that we only have a recorded myth of? Something that we can't officially understand. There's nothing that's actually recorded in epic detail of what truly happened. So all we have are these vague memories, these myths, these accounts that become blurred over time, that become confused. And then, as we establish a new history with constant historical revision, which we know happens, we realize that these events become even more confused. Perhaps Aurelian and the other leaders that were represented at that time were other leaders of Tartaria who fell to the corruption, or perhaps they died trying to defend their civilization. Consider the final destruction of Tartaria, with the last siege of the remaining cities. We have many different accounts of sieges of cities and their destruction, and these are very terrifying accounts of the last remnants of people trying to fight for survival. They must have known for years or decades or perhaps even longer that their destruction was imminent, and they faced a very horrifying reality. They knew that there were many efforts that were undertaken to try to save their civilization and to try to save their cities. And yet, despite their very best efforts, they were unable to defend themselves from this malevolent force that had been terrorizing them for such a long time. And suddenly they found themselves unable to defend themselves. We even have some images that indicate that there may have been cities such as Bologna that had some other means of defense. We're told that the great towers of Bologna were a means of both offense and defense, but that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, unless perhaps those towers had some other capability. We also consider the works of what we're told is high fantasy from J.R.R. Tolkien, such as the Fall of Gondolin, or indeed the complete destruction of all the elven kingdoms at the end of the First Age, as he calls it. Perhaps this is synonymous, and is indeed an exact account of what happened with not just the civilization that preceded ours, but indeed the civilizations that came before them. There's a lot of myth and a lot of folklore from many different peoples across the land. And yes, we do have accounts of a more biblical sense or a more religious sense of direct evil, of devils, demons, and other creatures. And indeed, there may be details behind that may be true. And for all we know, maybe it is an exact account. We just don't know. And what to make of the so-called heroes or the leaders that tried to preserve the civilization? Were they real? Were they corrupted? Or do we just have a very vague memory of them? We have no shortage of these terrifying apocalyptic images that show the unrelenting destruction of many of these great cities. And we're told that this is merely a time during the Middle Ages when people were driven by fear and superstition. Yet they were also capable of building large cathedrals and tremendous architectural achievements that stand with us to this day. This is why we have so many difficulties with the mainstream account. Why do we have fortifications that are in very remote places in the land? Unless there genuinely was some sort of effort undertaken in the past to try to enable a civilization to survive, an unrelenting threat that had forces beyond our wildest dreams that were constantly attacking and destroying it. And it seems as though these forces of Gog-Magog, or whatever this malevolent entity really was, only grew stronger as they increased the amount of land and lives that they destroyed each and every year in their total and complete destruction of the Fourth Era civilization. The people facing terror, trying to survive, trying to find a place where they could hide or where they'd be safe. Perhaps there was even an attempt to parlay one final negotiation to try to enable some portion of the civilization known as Tartaria to survive. And while there may have been an honest attempt at a parlay or a negotiation, it was simply a ruse. Simply a final ruse to bring down the last defenses of Tartaria, to leave them vulnerable for the attacking forces, which were then unleashed with their full potential, to destroy the remaining cities and to destroy the people of Tartaria, of the Fourth Era civilization that preceded ours, once and for all. And indeed, as we can attest to, everything was destroyed. Their society, their history. The only thing that remained were some of the structures, and indeed the foundation structures, perhaps remnants of the buildings that preceded them. What a terrifying time it must have been to realize that survival was not guaranteed, to realize that people would be without hope and without dreams, and their only hope was to try to live to see the next day. Oftentimes we're told that this is the lowest state of existence for human beings, and there's no doubt about it that in the previous civilizations they did face this many times. We're told in our current mainstream history that other peoples have faced this, and indeed they do to this very day. But I think it's important that we all remember that all of us in some way are connected to these survivors who underwent these trials and tribulations. That as long as there were survivors from this calamity, this downfall of civilization, there will always be hope for the future